I'm Professor Jagdish Sheth at Emory University in Atlanta. This particular presentation is on why Donald Trump reminds me of Ronald Reagan. At the second Republican debate for nomination, I began to watch Donald Trump more seriously because he was emerging as a very serious candidate. And it struck to me that it was a very similar rise of Ronald Reagan some time ago. It's very uncanny to compare these two individuals who are so different otherwise, but very parallel process. For example, Ronald Reagan was a Democrat, and he was also a union leader at one time. Donald Trump also was a Democrat, of course not a union leader. Ronald Reagan came from the largest state, California, liberal democratic state. Donald Trump comes from New York, second largest state, also relatively liberal democratic. Ronald Reagan really became a Republican and shifted his political affiliation during Barry Goldwater, which was the rise of extreme right at that time, probably due to protest against Vietnam War. Just around the time the US economy was in turmoil, politics were in turmoil. So does Donald Trump comes at a time when again there is a huge movement toward the extreme right in the Republican Party. In fact, that began with the Tea Party movement some time ago and took a hold where minority was controlling the majority of the Republican Party. Ronald Reagan actually brought Republican Party more to the center, right of the center, but more to the center. And it seems like Donald Trump is trying to do the same thing. In other words, both were actually reforming the party from which they got the nomination and, of course, eventually presidential election. I think the parallels are a lot deeper than that. For example, Ronald Reagan immediately teed up the anti-Mexican labor movement. Of course, target was mostly the labor in the farming community, as opposed to Mexican labor in the construction and other industries such as poultry, factories, etc. Ronald Reagan raised the same issue, rising illegal immigration. And ultimately, after election, he was able to have an immigration reform, which became quite a major achievement in his political career. Surprisingly, even though he stopped the Mexican migration, several states on the West Coast, such as the state of Oregon, had their own commission that pretty much advocated that if the migrant workers don't come to the state of Oregon, the whole economy shuts down in the state within 4 months or 6 months because it was so much agriculture oriented at that time, let's say in the early 80s. And therefore, they did allow migrant workers special permissions to come during the harvest time. Think about its possibilities similarly as we see the Trump administration evolving over next 4 years, if not 8 years. Second major agenda Ronald Reagan had was tax reforms. That America was non-competitive, especially to foreign multinationals, primarily Japan. And that's because they were not paying any taxes and our corporations were paying 55% corporate tax. And again, very successfully, Ronald Reagan was able to legislate whereby the tax reforms dropped the corporate tax to 35%. Donald Trump is advocating similarly, maybe dropping to 15-20% and a compromise at about 25%, it looks like. Ronald Reagan literally created an enemy out of nowhere, which was Japan. Japan, enemy number one. Global competitiveness, unfair competition. Again, currency is used by the Japanese, by yen is so devalued that their exports are cheaper than they should be. You see the same rhetoric now, but this time against China. The only difference is it is from Japan to China, but it's the same message. Ronald Reagan raised the defense spending enormously. Strategic Defense Initiative, for example, to come out with this satellite that will shield both the European nations, the NATO alliance, as well as America from any kind of a missile attack by the communist regime called Soviet Union. There is a similar, very strong increase in the defense budget under the Trump administration. Very strong message by the Reagan government that we are too much regulated. We need to deregulate. Even though President Carter, out of sheer desperation, had gone through wholesale deregulation of so many industries like the airline industry, the trucking industry, but did not create the economic spark within the first 4 years of his presidency, and probably the Reagan administration benefited quite a lot from the earlier deregulation. But Reagan administration very strongly believed that Washington was too bureaucratic, controlling the destiny of all the states and interfering in the state autonomy. He even advocated the position of new federalism, which means states are more important and the role of the central government or federal government is only primarily defense and nothing else. You see a very similar, in fact, architecture and articulation by the Trump administration. Reagan also brought lots of people who were not Washington natives. He brought a whole contingent of people in the administration from other parts of the country, both from the Midwest as well as, in fact, from California. Trump has done the same thing. If you look at the cabinet, it is not a strongly Washington-based career politicians or career diplomats, but consists of all kinds of people, especially from the South, surprisingly, such as Texas, Georgia, etc. Again, there seems to be a very similar parallel. Now, if parallels are there, can we therefore expect the future to come out the same way? I'm not so sure. First of all, there are very clear style differences between the two individuals. Reagan was literally cowboy. He loved to go back to his own ranch, cut the woods, chop the woods, as they call it, ride the horses. Trump actually is what I would call an urban socialite. He would rather be at a cocktail party in the evenings, maybe play golf, but they are two different individuals in style. Reagan was a polished actor by the time he became a politician. He knew how to put his emotions behind a script which will be written for him, and he obeyed the script. Trump does not seem to like the script, and not only that, but he uses Twitter with a language that does not look like a polished language of a statesman. What about substantive differences? And there are quite a few. The first major substantive difference is today we have a more turbulent world than under Reagan administration. In fact, the world turbulence has gone enormously since trade was used as a globalization to create global growth, let's say from the early 90s. Abolition of the GATT and creating WTO resulted in more free trade, not only of products but also of people. There was no European Union when Reagan administration was in place. Today we have a full-blown European Union which has expanded beyond the original 12 common market nations. And the world is more turbulent in the Middle East or the Arab countries than ever before. It is in transition. Collapse of communism led to, in fact, many ex-communist or former communist countries in transition economies. So today's world is a lot more complex and more dynamic and more turbulent than ever before. You had the Contra issues in Latin America that Reagan had to deal, but that was just a minor in scope and scale than what is today's reality. Today, Donald Trump has to fight multiple fronts. There was only one front under Reagan, which was the Soviet bloc. And how do you defeat the Soviet Union from an ideological viewpoint? And fortunately, it did happen where communism collapsed, not because of Reagan. It was collapsing from the late 70s, but it triggered at the end during the Reagan administration. 1989 is the official date, but the seeds were already planted quite some time. You had revolutions in Poland, in many of the Soviet territories in many ways, and ultimately it came home in Moscow. Today there are at least 3 fronts we have to fight. And the military capability of fighting 3 fronts is just not there, as opposed to fighting one front with what I would call more a rational enemy, as opposed to lots of irrational enemies, such as the ISIS, with the fundamentalism and using terrorism as a way of fighting a war, like the Vietnam guerrilla war in many ways, for example. Fighting the traditional communist bloc and its ideology, but also the rise of Asia as a major military and economic power, especially China. Unlike Japan, which actually had no defense capability after the surrender of Japan in World War II, they were barred from having defense industry, public or private sector. China, as new formidable competitor, is very strong in its hard power, military power, and also exercising its soft power. So the game is very different when Japan was enemy number 1 from economic viewpoint. Today, China is an enemy number 1. China will be more formidable in negotiations and in balancing the 2 interests properly than with Japan at one time. I also find that Reagan administration focused on Central and Latin America. While he began with the argument of anti-trade, eventually he became pro-trade advocate and even advocated after the success of NAFTA what he saw, that he could even see the day when there will be free trade of all Americas, FTA as they call it. But the focus of the Reagan administration was more toward Latin America, Central America, and somewhat toward the NATO alliance primarily, or European Union as we call it today. Here the focus is going to be surprisingly more on Asia. Asia will be the next major challenge, which is quite far from America, and you have lots of hotspots or sparks over there that can get out of hand very quickly. Reagan did something that was very interesting, and I think is going to happen with China now. He strongly teed up the idea to the Japanese government and the Japanese zaibastos, which are the large multi-subsidiary corporations like Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, that rather than export from Japan, they must invest in America. And it did happen. The automobile sector became a bone of contention, and Toyota, Nissan, and Honda, all 3 major car makers, began to assemble automobiles in America, in the state of Kentucky, Ohio, etc. Green plant, brand new facilities were built. I think something similar will happen with China. While we'll have a public opinion which is anti-Chinese from a trade policy viewpoint, in reality, we will allow Chinese to buy or invest in America into enterprises, especially in those Chinese corporations which are becoming global, such as Haier in appliances, which has bought out GE Appliance, for example, in steel at the same time, would be in fact in commodities, but could be in cell phones, could be in e-commerce. I can give you examples after examples where Chinese multinationals will go global, and US is a very large and an important strategic market to counterbalance their global competitors. And the battle will grow in America as a battleground, market battleground, especially against Japanese corporations that are here and the Korean corporations that are here. There are no really American corporations. That includes consumer electronics, that includes appliances, that includes many industries. So I'm watching how much China will invest in America for its own strategic global expansion. And most of the investment of Chinese corporations are likely to come from their state enterprises, which have the scale and the ambition to go global. And by the way, Reagan administration actually had used media to suggest that US government can raise the yen from 110 yen to 90. Remember, it was 250 yen. It already appreciated to 110 yen. They said by raising it even more through intervention to 90 yen, America can make export unprofitable, uncompetitive from Japan. You will see something similar. You see the rise of Chinese yuan now, gradually, but eventually it is very likely that Chinese will invest massively in America, often converting, like with Japan, what we did, public debt converted into private equity. So the role of private equity will grow enormously as bridge capital, but eventually massive mergers and acquisitions will take place, where many industries US will exit. Under Japan, we exited, for example, the television industry, the watch industry. Japan bought out almost Hawaii as an island, invested in Rockefeller Center. Same thing is going to happen this time, is my forecast. This parallel, I think we need to watch. And if you go back to the playbook of the Reagan administration, based upon its circumstances, and see the kinds of initiatives they made or challenges they managed, we can probably learn and anticipate what can happen with the Trump administration. Thank you very much.